Today I'm going to show you how to make the ROO tote bag. This has been a pattern I've wanted to release for such a long time. It's been in my head and I've been trying to figure out the best way to make it and how many pockets and the best size and everything like that. As you can guess from the name ROO, it has multiple pockets. I thought it was quite a fitting name for a bag with lots of pockets. The pattern is linked in the description if you want to give it a go. It's definitely an intermediate make. I would not recommend for beginner sewers. But saying that, if you watch the video and you think you can have a go at that, then give it a go. This is how we learn. So let me show you the 3 different variations of fabric that I make the ROO tote bag in. It's obviously your preference which one you choose to go for. If you have a home sewing machine that's not all that strong, steer clear of the canvas version and steer clear of very thick cotton straps, and also steer clear of stiff interfacing in the straps. So those are your 3 things that I don't recommend using if you have a small home sewing machine. If you have a more heavy duty machine, then you can definitely get away with those versions, but I will chat you through the different materials and you can figure out which one you think might be best for you. So this is the ROO tote bag, and this version is made with bag foam, which is actually very easy to use, and you'd definitely be able to use it if you have a domestic home sewing machine. It looks like it would be really thick, but it's actually very lightweight and just sort of holds a lot of structure. I would definitely recommend getting the fusible version. Always go for the fusible version of wadding whenever you're looking for wadding. It just makes your life so much easier. And the straps on this were made with a medium interfacing. I'd say the medium interfacing is the best for straps if you're going to make them yourself at home, because it still has a bit of movement in them. I've made some with firm and I'll show you those. You can have the option not to add the long shoulder strap, especially if you're struggling to find the hardware. You can just remove that element altogether and just have the tabs without any hardware. So there's one long main zip. Then we have a little pocket at the back, and I put this pocket here because I hate rifling through my bag to find my keys, or if I'm on the train and I have a ticket and I don't know where to put it, I put it in here. It's just a very small zipped pocket that is just super handy for things that you need easy access to that you don't want to go into your main bag for. Then the top of the bag has one long zip, and inside you can see all of the pockets. This part is always hard to show you, but let's see how it goes. So on this side we have one long pocket. So this houses small laptops and iPads, and that goes all the way down to the base of the bag. This is an A4 sketchbook. I shall put that in there. Got loads of room still. At the side you have a water bottle holder, which just keeps bottles upright in the bag so they don't fall down and keep getting lost in the bag. On the other side you have 2 pockets. I find these useful for putting chargers in. You have a little bag clip. All of these pockets are optional, you can chop and change as you like. And then there's also a little zipped internal pocket, which I think fits a phone. Yeah. That fits my phone, and that's an iPhone 16 Pro Max, the big one. Fits a big iPhone. And then you have all of that room for everything else that you might want in your bag. This area here, when you come to sew the bag, is where it gets tricky if you have a machine that can't go through multiple layers of fabric very easily. So that's when you're looking for straps, just think, can I sew over it, doubled over, and through 2 layers of fabric? This is the canvas version of the ROO tote bag. This is one I've been using quite a bit. This one I used stiff interfacing in the straps, and they're very stiff. And I really wanted to do a little bit of embroidery at the top there, so I've got my initials, and it's obviously got these 2 different sections, top and bottom, so you can really chop and change with the prints and patterns. This is the one I've been using over the last few days. It's got my laptop in here, This won't fit all sizes of laptop. I've got quite a small laptop. I have my mini tripod sat at the bottom. I have my hard drives. You know, I have all sorts in here. And I've got my laptop charger sat in one of these pockets here. Water bottle sits in the corner just there. And then you can sort of just tuck it under before you zip it up. So that's the canvas version with things in it. I'll just take them out so you can see what it looks like without. This is without anything in the canvas version. It's a lot more floppy than the other one. I made the base of the bag nice and wide so that it sort of all flops onto itself. And then this is the soft quilted version. It obviously doesn't stand up on its own, but as soon as you put a few things in it, it starts to stand up. For example, if I put my jumper in, because it's got that wide base, it starts to stand up on its own, even though it's still got that nice softness and drape to it. I actually think this is probably my favourite version, just because it has that softness to it. I love a soft bag. It's much easier to sew a thinner wadding. For this one I used Vilene H640, and this one has medium interfacing in the straps. Here's two more that I've made if you want some more inspiration. This is another quilted structured version of the ROO tote bag with the bag foam, and for this one I just used lots of different checks of the same shade, so there's a whole lot of gingham going on there. And then on the inside of this one you can also play around with using different fabrics for the pockets and different fabric for the pocket bags, which I didn't do for this one. You don't have to use metal zips. I recommend using metal zips for the outer two zips, but you don't have to. You can just use plastic ones. I just prefer the look of the metal ones. Here is another canvas version. This one is a bit battered because it was my test bag. For this one I used pre-made straps, and on the inside I did a nice contrasting stripe, and then I also did contrasting fabric inside the pockets, which I quite liked. Quite a good way of using up scraps, I guess, if you want to have different fabrics as your pocket bags. I really hope you all enjoy making and using this bag. I am definitely enjoying using the bag and thinking of making a waterproof version at some point. I think that might be quite useful for the rubbish English weather. So I'm going to get on and show you how I make the ROO tote bag. As always, we start out by printing the pattern on A0 paper or A4 or US letter paper. Whichever one you go for, it's very important that you print it at 100% scale. Then it's time to start choosing your materials. In this video, I'm going to be making the structured quilted version. So I've gone for two different contrasting cottons for the outer and this lovely cotton poplin for the lining. I'm using some fusible bag foam, but if you're making the soft quilted version, you'll use a mid-loft wadding a bit like this, which is Vilene H640. You'll also need some mid-weight fusible interfacing, and if you wanted to make very rigid straps, you could use the stiff or firm interfacing, but just beware that it doesn't always go through machines very well. You will also need a selection of hardware for this bag. The zip sizes are all listed in the instruction booklet. I recommend using metal zips for the two outer zips and plastic for the inside, just to reduce the weight of the bag. For the bottle pocket, you'll need some elastic. Then you'll also need some other hardware items if you want to make the long shoulder strap. You'll need a slider, you'll need two swivel hooks and two D-rings. And then if you want to add the key clip inside the bag, you will also need a little clip like this. So once you've chosen your fabrics, you can get started on cutting out the pattern. Unlike all of my other patterns, do not cut any of the notches. Apart from the centre of the bottle pocket, that's the only notch you will need to cut. You can mark them with pencil, just don't cut into them, and I end up going back to the paper pattern to refer to where the notches are. There's quite a few bits of interfacing to cut out. I like to use my rotary cutter to cut this out. When it comes to cutting the main body fabric, you will need to cut larger than the paper pattern piece. This is because once you've done your quilting, the fabric will all shrink down a bit, so leave
enough room for shrinkage. I choose to quilt in 2 big rectangles, but you could cut this up into 4 smaller sections to make life a bit easier. Then I place it on top of the bag foam to get the right size, and I come back to the quilting later on. We're going to start by making the straps. If you're using pre-made straps, then you can skip along. I will leave timestamps in the description below. But we need to cut the straps first. I usually use my ruler and rotary cutter, but this fabric rips really nicely, so saved me all that time of cutting it out. I then cut out all of the interfacing pieces I needed. I gave the straps a good iron, and then using a bit of scrap fabric to protect the ironing board and the iron, I placed the interfacing on the wrong side of the fabric and fused that on. To make the straps, we're going to head back to the iron, fold the fabric lengthways so that it's folded in half with wrong sides facing each other. Open the strap up so you can see the center crease, and we're going to fold both of the long edges in to meet that center crease. Then fold it all on top of itself again, hiding the raw edges in the middle, and give it a good press. We're then going to edge stitch along that open length and then repeat that on the other side. And then I like to add 2 more rows, 0.5 centimeters in from the edge or from your previous stitch line. It adds strength, looks good, and it also helps stop the strap from creasing quite as much when you're holding it. So repeat that to all of the strap lengths and then take them over to the ironing board and give them a really good press. You then need to trim down the straps and the zip tab to be the correct lengths. These are all listed in the instruction booklet. Now you've finished making the straps and the tabs, they'll be ready for when you need them in the bag making process. If you're making a crossbody strap, then we're going to add the hardware to that now. So we're going to start by threading one of your swivel hooks through the end of your 1 inch wide strap. You're going to fold that back by about 1 inch or 3 centimeters and pin that into place. Then at the other end, you're going to want to add the slider, and you want that middle bit of the slider to be showing through at the back. So the same side that you folded the other end over. Pull the slider onto the strap and then find your other swivel hook, and we're going to add that to the end. This is where it gets a little bit confusing, but we're going to bring that raw edge of the strap and we're going to bring it around so that it loops back on itself through the middle of that slider. So you might need to adjust the strap to get some room so that you can fit the raw end of that strap into the middle of the slider and back out. Once you've got it through the middle, you will take that same raw end and you will fold it back on itself, pin that into place, and we can go and stitch them down. Some of my pattern testers thought it would look nicer if you folded the ends under, and if you want to do that, you can go ahead and do that. I just find it gets a bit too bulky in my machine. So when I stitch it down, I use a short stitch length of around 2 and I go over the end of the raw end of that strap. So I'm sort of encasing that end in quite a few rows of stitching. Then find your zip end tabs and thread your D-rings through them. I then go and add a few rows of stitches 0.5 centimeters away from the raw edge just to hold that into place. And there is your crossbody strap and zip end tabs ready to go. Moving on to quilting, if you're making the canvas version, you can skip along. I like to start by giving my outer fabrics a really good iron, and then I lay them on top of my fusible bag foam and give it a really good press onto the bag foam. I found that the bag foam needed quite a long time for the iron to be sat on top of it to actually fuse it to the bag foam. So just take your time with this step. If your wadding is not fusible, I would add quite a few pins to stop it from moving all over the place. You can buy little quilting pins, which are quite useful. They look like little bent safety pins, and they're really good for holding all of your layers into place. So once I fused on my bag foam, I went ahead and planned out my quilted design. For this, I used some tailor's chalk, but you can use all sorts. You can use erasable pens. Some people use little tools where you just sort of mark the fabric with a dent. I sometimes use my sewing machine foot as a guide. I have this special quilting foot where you can measure distances, and that's very useful. I use that for the top of the quilting section, as you can see here. I use a stitch length of 3 or 4 when I'm quilting, and it is time consuming, but it's always so worth it. So once you've finished quilting, you can then place your top and bottom main body pieces back on top and cut them out. If you've done a specific geometric quilting style like I have here, I tend to try and line up the center of one of the quilted lines down the center of the pattern piece. Or if you've got a specific directional fabric, just make sure it's all lined up as you like it. Now we're going to add the short straps. So with the top half of the main body piece, we're going to find the notches where the strap placement is. You can use the notches like this, or you can measure in from the side and make sure it's measured at the same distance at the top, making sure it's sitting at a really nice 90-degree angle. You then want to take note of where you're going to stitch across the top of the strap. And I like to mark that with little pins, and this marks the line that you will stitch across. Following the stitch guideline, you're going to go up the side, along the top and back down. I turn the stitch length down to 2 so that it's nice and small, because we want a good amount of strength in these straps. Now we're going to stitch the boxed cross, and this adds a good amount of strength. This is the point where the strap is most likely to come undone, so it's important we reinforce this bit. I like to take my ruler and measure where I need to start the boxed cross, and sometimes I will draw on the diagonal lines as well. So with a short stitch length again, we're going to go across the bottom, making sure we backstitch, then across one diagonal, along the top and across the other diagonal, and again finishing with some back stitches. Give the strap a good press, and then we're going to repeat the same steps for the other side of the bag. This is what your top half pieces should be looking like, and now we can move on to adding the bottom half of the main body piece. So to construct these two together, you want to have them right sides facing, and we're going to pin all the way along that center seam. Stitch across the center with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And we're going to trim down the seam allowance on the bottom half of the bag only by 0.5 centimeters. You don't want to trim the top half seam allowance, because that's going to sit on top of the bottom half when we do the next top stitching step. We're then going to press that seam allowance so that it's all facing towards the bottom of the bag. We're going to be top stitching on top of the bottom half of the bag, but before you do this, especially if you're using the bag foam, I would take a scrap of your fabric and just play around with your top stitching. If you're doing the canvas version, you might even want to get some top stitching thread and top stitch along with that. So you can either edge stitch very close to the seam, catching that seam allowance underneath, or you can stitch 0.5 centimeters from that seam allowance. On the bag foam, I like to stitch just past the seam, but on the other versions, I stitch 0.5 centimeters away. Now is also a good time to add the label to the front of your bag. Don't place it too high up because remember the zip's going to be there and the bag sort of curves over a little bit at the top. We're going to add our first zipped pocket. This is the exterior welt zip pocket. If you're new to welt pockets or you just want to have a little refresh, I would leave all of the outer bits till last and go ahead and do the lining welt pockets to start with, just to get a good practice in. So find the right pocket bag. You're going to add the interfacing to the area it needs to, that's shown on the pattern piece. And we're going to trace off the welt opening. You can do this by adding pins or measuring. I saw one of my testers cut open the slot and traced it through there, which was very clever. I'm definitely going to do that next time. Then with the main body top half pattern piece, you're going to look at the notches and see where the placement of the top of the pocket bag needs to sit. And we're going to place that pocket bag with right sides facing one of the outer body pieces. This won't be the side that you've added a label if you have added a label. We're going to keep the stitch length nice and short again, and we're going to just follow that traced line of the welt pocket opening. Make sure you have really nice sharp corners on your stitching here. And then before I cut the welt opening, I like to iron the pocket bag down and up to sort of give it a bit of a crease. You can understitch if you'd rather, but I find just ironing does the trick. Then we're going to snip through the welt pocket opening. So I like to pinch the fabric and chop into it with my scissors, and then I go most of the way along and I stop about 1 centimeter or 0.5 centimeters from each edge, and then using my scissors or some snips, I cut as close as I can into those corners without cutting the stitching. If you do cut into the stitching, don't worry too much. You can just go and stitch around it again. Once you've snipped all of those corners, you can then post the pocket bag through to the wrong side of the bag and manipulate that pocket bag so that it sits nice and flat. The bag foam does make it a little tricky to pull it through because it likes to spring back on itself. So I tend to hold it into place with some pins at the top, and then I go and take it over to the ironing board and give it a good press. Try to make sure none of the pocket bag is showing through from the front. Then we're going to find our smallest zip and we're going to place that into the opening. You can pin that into place, but I also like to use very thin double-sided sticky tape as a bit of a cheat. I think you can buy quilter's tape as well that probably dissolves eventually when you wash it, but this seems to be just fine, and it holds the zip into place very nicely at the back of the bag. Then I forgot to here, but I would change to a zip foot because it would make this bit a lot easier. And you're going to stitch all the way around the outside of that welt pocket opening. I keep the stitch length short for this bit so that it's nice and held into place. Now that the zip is stitched into place, we can fold up the bottom of the pocket bag so that it meets the top of the pocket bag and pin that into place. And we're going to stitch around this pocket with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Again, you will need the zip foot for doing this. We're going up the side, along the top and down just on the pocket bag. You will need to manipulate the bag a little bit for this. Then once you've sewn the sides and the top, you can place the pocket bag so that it's sitting flat against the main body of the bag and just edge stitch along that top, just so that the pocket bag is held into place. And there we go, that's the first welt zip pocket done. Time to get started on the lining. We're going to start with the pleated pocket. So to make the pleated pocket, one of your pieces should be interfaced with the interfacing on the wrong side of the fabric. Both pieces are then placed right sides facing, and we're going to stitch all the way around, leaving a gap at the bottom. Go ahead and snip the corners to reduce some bulk, and then we're going to turn the pleated pocket bag through so that the right sides are facing you. I then use my little tool to poke out the corners. I take it over to the ironing board and press the pocket flat, making sure all the corners and edges are nicely pushed out. And then with the gap we left, I fold that in nicely and give it a press before going ahead and edge stitching that closed. With the lining main body piece, you can see the area where the pocket is going to sit, and we want to concentrate on that center line to start with. So start by folding the pleated pocket in half and figuring out where the placement is on your lining. You can then take the paper pattern piece away and make sure the pocket is sat in the right place. Take note of the center of the pocket bag, and this is where we're going to stitch down to start with. Once you've stitched down the center of the pocket, we're going to start adding our pleats. Start by folding it across that line of stitching that we've just done. You can use a paper pattern piece or a ruler to figure out the pleat size. Pin that into place, and then you're going to fold it back on itself so that you can see that center stitch line, and you're going to be folding it right along that center stitch line. And again, pin that into place and do the same on the other side. Once you've pinned your pleats, you'll want to make sure the rest of the pocket bag is looking nice and rectangular, and then you can pin that into place. When it comes to stitching on the pocket, you'll go down one side, along the bottom, and up the other side. Then add another row of stitches parallel to the ones you've just done, but this time 0.5 centimeters away. Then take your pins out, and you now have your double pleated pocket. Now we're going to make the small welt zip pocket in the lining. Again, you want to start with the interfacing fused onto the wrong side of the pocket bag. The placement for this is found on the pattern piece. You'll then need to trace off the opening for the welt zip pocket. And then with your main body lining piece, the one that has the pleated pocket, we're going to find the notches that line up for the top placement of this pocket bag. Place the pocket bag right side spacing on top of the main body lining piece, and just go ahead and pin that into place. We're then going to go and stitch around the opening that we traced off. Make sure you're using a nice short stitch length for this. I use setting 2 on my sewing machine. Before I cut into the opening, I like to fold the top of the pocket bag over, give it a press, and fold the bottom up towards that stitch line. This just makes your life a little bit easier when it comes to turning the pocket through. I then chop into the center of that opening, and I cut all the way along, leaving a space of around 0.5 centimeters at each end. And then with my scissors or some snips, I snip right into the corners, making sure not to catch any of the stitches. If you do, don't worry, you can go around and re-stitch that rectangle. Then post the pocket bag through to the back of the lining, and we're going to iron it so that it sits nice and flat. You want the top of the pocket bag to be in line with the top of the main body lining piece. You then want to find your small zip for the lining, place that on top and pin it into place. In the previous step with the external pocket, I showed how I use double-sided sticky tape sometimes, but if the fabric's a little more flimsy, I find I don't need the double-sided tape to hold the zip into place, and that pins will do the job. Change to a zip foot and stitch all the way around that opening. Now we can fold the bottom of the pocket bag up to meet the top of the pocket bag, and we're going to pin the sides and top of the pocket bag. Then you'll need to stitch up the side, along the top, and down the other side of the pocket bag. Make sure you fold the main body of the lining away so you don't get it caught in the side seams. Once you've stitched all the way around, you can then lay the pocket bag flat and edge stitch along the top of the pocket bag, catching the main body lining. This keeps the pocket nicely in place. And there we have the first lining welt zip pocket. To make the larger zip pocket in the lining, you follow the exact same process that I've just shown. At this point, I also added another one of my labels to my lining. I just held the large zip pocket bag out of the way and stitched that on. To make the bottle holder, you're going to start by folding and pressing the long edge down by 1 centimetre and then follow it with another 1.5 centimetres. Take that over to your sewing machine and we're going to stitch along the bottom edge of the fold. And now you've got a channel seam for the elastic to sit in. I forgot to take note of the centre of the pocket bag, but this will be very useful in a later step. We're now going to add a parallel row of gathering stitches along the bottom. Make sure you have a long stitch length of around 4 or 5 here. And we're going to start by adding a few back stitches and then just stitch all the way along. And when you get to the end, you want to leave nice long thread ends. And then I took the 2 top threads and pulled them a little bit just to gather up the fabric. We'll finish the gathering at a later stage in the process. Then we're going to grab our elastic, and I like to mark out how much I'm going to need before threading it through, and then I don't chop it, I thread it through to start with a safety pin until I reach the other end, and then I will secure that end in place. And then I will pull on the elastic until I find the mark of my measurement. I will then stitch that down before chopping the elastic. The measurement here is quite a loose measurement for the bottle, just because when I tried it tighter, it was quite hard to get the bottle in and out, but you can adjust the amount of elastic for however big your bottle is. We're then going to fold the bottle holder in half so that wrong sides are facing each other, and you've got the elastic at the top and the gathering stitches at the bottom. Then find one of your main body lining pieces and you're going to place the bottle holder against the side. And we're going to hold that into place with a row of stitches 0.5 centimetres away from the edge. Make sure you don't stitch over any of those gathering tail ends. That's as far as you can get for now with the bottle holder. We'll finish the bottom of it in a later step. If you want to add a little key clip, you're going to find your pattern piece and do the same method for making the straps. Fold it in half so that wrong sides are facing, then fold the long edges in to meet the centre crease and everything on top of itself. And then you can just edge stitch down the open end. Once you've stitched that together, you just thread it through the end of the clip, fold it back on itself and add a row of stitching. On the lining main body pattern piece, there's a note for where the placement is for the key clip. So place that onto your lining, pin it into place, and then we're going to stitch a rectangle to hold that on. The reason we're not just stitching it across the top is because it likes to come out and get stuck in the zip. So this way it stays inside your bag. So there is your lining ready to be attached to the main zip. But first we have to prepare the main zip. We're going to add the zip end covers at each end by folding the zip end covers in half, right sides facing, and placing them on each end of the zip. With your zip foot attached, you want to stitch as close as you can to the last tooth. When it comes to the open end of the zip, I like to stitch the tails on first, just to hold them into place, and then I will open the zip, fold the cover over, and stitch up to the first tooth. Unfold the tab and give it a good press. We then need to chop some of the excess off by taking a measurement from the folded line. And then I like to add just a little row of stitches at the end of the zip tabs to hold them into place. Now comes the big moment, attaching the main zip. So we've got one outer main body piece here, and we're going to take the zip, flip it over so that right sides are facing, and we're going to pin the zip all the way along the top. It might hang over the edge a little bit, but that's okay. You want it to be a little bit longer than too short. Then take one of the lining pieces and place it right sides facing the outer main body so that it's on top of the zip, and I pin that all into place. It can be a lot easier to tack the zip onto the main body first and then put the lining on. Because the seam allowance here is quite small, it can be a little bit of a tricky step. So we're going to stitch along the top of the zip with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. Make sure your layers are all in line as you go. If they're not, don't worry, just check and see that you've stitched it all okay. And if you haven't, just go back and add a few more stitches. We're then going to fold both of those pieces out of the way so that we have access to the other side of the zip. And I'm going to place the other outer piece on top with right sides facing. Pin that into place, turn it over and add the lining on top of the other lining piece, right sides facing. And again, stitch along the top with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. Take the bag over to the ironing board and give both sides of the zip a little bit of a press with all of the fabric pointing away from it. Then, like with my toiletry bag and the zip pouch, we're going to top stitch along the edge of the zip, and we're going to be catching the seam allowance underneath the outer side, but all of the lining will be on the other side, and we're not catching any of the lining, just the seam allowance. This can be a little fiddly, so I just keep checking that I've got the seam allowance caught under the top stitching and that the lining's out of the way as I go along. Take the bag back over to the ironing board and press everything away from the zip. Now we're going to add our zip end tabs. If you're skipping the hardware section, you'll need to fold your tabs in half without adding the D-rings. And we're going to pin the zip tabs at each end of the zip. And then we're just going to add a little row of stitching to hold them into place 0.5 centimeters away from the edge. It's then very important that you open up the main zip at this point. And we're going to place both outer pieces right sides facing and both lining pieces right sides facing. Before we stitch all the way down the side seams, we're going to match up the two outer sides where the two different fabrics join first. We really want to make sure we match these up properly, because when you carry the bag, it's almost the first thing you see. So we want to make sure they're nice and in line. So once you're happy that those two bits are lining up, you can then go and stitch the rest of the side seam. And then we're just going to stitch one of the side seams for the lining, and that is the side with the water bottle holder. Don't stitch the other side just yet. Depending on how sturdy your fabric is, you might need to use a zip foot for this, because it can get a bit tight around where the zip is. But just stitch down the sides with the usual 1 centimeter seam allowance. And then take the bag over to the ironing board and open up those side seams. I do it as best as I can with this bag foam, but it likes to spring back on itself. Now we're going to finish off the bottle holder pocket. So we're going to open up the lining so we can see that side seam we just stitched. You'll have the side seam lying flat, and then we're going to flatten the bottle holder so that the gathering is all flat along this corner. You need to leave a gap at each side of the pocket, and you can find that center notch and match it up to the side seam. Manipulate the gathers as desired, pin it into place, and we're just going to stitch that on with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. Now that that's done, we can go and stitch the other side of the lining and close that up. We can also stitch along the bottom of the main body of the bag and along the bottom of the lining, but make sure you leave a big gap at the bottom of the lining to turn the bag through. If you can, try and open up the seam again. You don't really need to do it on the lining, but it can be helpful for the outer. Now with the seam allowance all pressed open, we're going to box off the corners. So just push up the bottom of the bag so that it meets that side seam. We're going to match the bottom and the side seam together, pin that into place, repeat it on the other side, and then we're going to repeat that for the lining. Then go ahead and stitch along that with the usual 1 centimetre seam allowance. Now comes another fiddly part. We're going to box off the top corner. So to do this, you want to be looking at the side of the bag, and we're going to have to sort of create it in a bit of a triangle shape here. It can take a little moment to manipulate the fabric into the right place, but we want the main body fabric to be looking like this, and then you want to mirror the image of the lining on top. And you will also have the zip tab sandwiched in between there as well. So there is a lot of fabric to stitch through here. So just take your time. You might need to crank your sewing machine by hand when you're stitching this, and just go really slowly so that you don't break a needle. Then go ahead and repeat that to the other corner. Now we're going to connect the lining to the base of the bag. So to do this, we're going to squish the bag so that you can see both bases of the outer and the lining. Then you're going to fold the lining on top of the base of the outer, and you're going to find the box corner seam allowance, and you're going to match those seam allowances together, pin it into place, and we're going to stitch across the seam allowance. This is a fiddly step, but so worth it because it stops the lining from moving all around inside your bag. Then in the middle of there, you should be able to find the hole that you left in the lining, and we're going to pull the bag through that hole and start pushing out all of the corners so that it resembles a bag. Check that you're happy with the corners you've stitched and that you've caught all of the fabric, especially at the top corners. And then we can go and close the gap in the lining. To do this, I just hold the fabric together and top stitch along the opening. You can stitch this by hand, but I find this does the trick. Now you just need to turn the bag the right way around, push out all of the corners, and there you have almost a finished ROO tote bag. That is definitely the most satisfying part, turning the bag the right way around. If you've made a shoulder strap, you can attach it now. If your bag has room to accommodate a zip pull, I find this is a nice little finishing touch. I only add these on the outer 2 zips, but as always, we're going to start by folding the fabric wrong sides facing in half, open it out, and fold the long edges to meet the center crease. Then you just want to fold the long edges on top of each other and stitch along that open edge. Tie it onto your zip pull however you prefer. I like to thread mine through and tie it into a knot, or you could thread it through and stitch it closed and then stitch the ends up. I then like to just chop off the ends and add a little bit of clear nail varnish to seal the ends in. And there we go, there is your finished ROO tote bag. This is such a satisfying moment, seeing the final bag all come together with all of the different lining components. There is a lot to this bag, so well done if you've got this far. If you decide to have a go at making your own ROO tote bag, I really hope you enjoy making it, and I would love to see a picture, so do tag me on Instagram. Just as a little reminder, these are the different versions that you can make the ROO tote bag in, and this is how they look with different fabrics. I hope you're all having a wonderful day, and I will see you in my next video.